It's finally time to talk once again about my favorite demigod in Elden Ring, Miquella the Unalloyed. I talked about the demigod himself in my first Elden Ring video, check it out if you want to learn more about him, but this time we're going to talk less about the demigod and more about his Haligtree, with a theory on what I think he was trying to do with it. Also, I know Miquella has a lot of cut content that was discovered, but I won't be talking about any of the cut content in this video, just to keep it consistent. I mean, since it's cut content, I'm not sure if it'll ever be implemented or not, so for now, I won't get into any of the cut content. So before we get into the crack theory, let's take a tour within the Haligtree and see what secrets it contains. I promise it will make sense later on, or at least I'll try to make it make sense. Now, before we can even reach the Haligtree, it is hidden away from the prying eyes of many, behind many trials and tribulations. The first step to even getting to the Haligtree is to be able to enter the consecrated snowfield, which in of itself is hidden, and the only way to get there is by acquiring 2 pieces of a sacred medallion. These medallions are hidden away in an Albinoric village in Liyue, which we won't get into anymore because I covered that in my last video, you can check it out. But for the second medallion, we find it within Castle Sol. Castle Sol also protects the Haligtree from prying eyes. As you can see, you can actually see the Haligtree from the castle. But we'll circle back to what Miquella has need of Castle Sol later in the theory section, as it's a pretty interesting one. When we have both halves of the medallion, you can finally enter the consecrated snowfield, and even then, the Haligtree is still out of reach. In order to even enter the vicinity of the Haligtree, you have to pass through a perpetual blizzard with only lights guiding the way, and the town of Ordina. Within the town, you have to complete the trial of the Evergaol. Interestingly, within the Evergaol, you'll find some Black Knife assassins. You'd even find a corpse of a Black Knife assassin within Ordina. Now, I don't think the Black Knife assassins are here defending the Haligtree, rather they're definitely trapped within the Evergaol, but that's open to speculations. A simple trial like this is no match for our wit. We simply have to light the statues of Miquella in order to pass the trial, and upon successfully completing the trial, we can finally enter the domain of the Haligtree. First thing I want to talk about here are the envoys. From my last video, I got questions regarding if these are Albinorics. My answer is no, they're not. Weirdly enough, I'm not sure what they are, but based on their item drops and the item descriptions that talk about them, they are some sort of bloodless monster that appears when there is an arrival of a new god. Whether they're here for Miquella or Malenia is unknown, but I'm 100% sure they aren't Albinorics. At least that's what we get from the item descriptions that talk about them. In any case, back to the Haligtree, as we can see, it isn't doing so well. It's slowly being taken over by the Scarlet Rot, not only due to Malenia's presence, but also due to Miquella's absence. The tree itself looks like it stopped growing and instead is withering away slowly. I do believe that the tree itself is pretty much dead, or at least close to dead at this point. This starting area of the Haligtree as well is devoid of any Haligtree soldiers, knights, and cleanrot knights. Instead, we see them far below in Elfile. Here, we find the Misbegotten and ants, giant ants. I have no doubts that the Misbegotten were welcomed into the embrace of the Haligtree. I mean, they perfectly fit the type of people Miquella strived to protect. But it seems like the neglect and maybe the Scarlet Rot drove them mad at some point, and the death and destruction we see here may have been done by them unintentionally, which may be the reason why we see them begging for forgiveness. The Misbegotten have this tendency of rebelling, as we saw previously in Castle Morn, so they may have also rebelled here due to hunger at some point, as we can see a lot of them eating the corpses of those not affected by the Scarlet Rot. But we also see a lot of them begging for forgiveness, maybe after they sated their hunger they realize what they have done. Whether Miquella will forgive them or not is something we'll never know. We also find a lot of these rotted husks, and without the protection of Miquella, this might have been the previous denizens who succumbed to the scarlet rot. These ones are littered all throughout this area, and they aren't being eaten by the misbegotten, probably because, well, they're suffering from the scarlet rot and you don't want that anywhere close to you. Now going further, we interestingly find some spirit snails here who summon crystallians. The spirit snails themselves are a very interesting addition that we'll come back to later again in the theory section. And further beyond this, we find very interesting mages deep within. I believe these mages might have come here with Loretta, but what's even more interesting is that these mages are known as scholars of Haima Conspectus. Mages who sought power to quell conflict. Their glintstone crowns are also bestowed by Raya Lucaria for scholars whose pursuits were deemed worthy. Is that pursuit helping Loretta find a home for the Albinaurics? Or is it assisting Miquella with his Haligtree? Maybe even Raya Lucaria sees Miquella's Haligtree as a pursuit to quell conflict. Then again, if you look at these mages closely, you'll see that their bracers cover their arms, which seems to be infused with primeval sorcery. If you equip the battle mage bracers yourself, it doesn't change your arm to have the azure-like crystal. This is true for all Haima mages throughout the lands between, not just here. I've checked the one in Caelid and the one in Altus Plateau, they all have this azure arm. Now it could be a coincidence, or maybe these kinds of mages learn a little bit of primeval sorcery, which is a type of sorcery that is based off the origin of glintstone. If we look at the primeval sorcery from Azure, for example, it is said to be the origin of glintstone. And if you look at the primal glintstone from Selen, primeval sorcery can be used to basically transfer one's soul into the primal glintstone and allow you to move bodies. But again, something we'll come back to in the theory section, but you might be seeing a pattern at this point. Beyond this though, we face Loretta, who may have been tasked with protecting this area. Another interesting point here is the statue at the center, which depicts 3 people. The only people that come to mind with this would be Malenia, Miquella, and Queen Marika. Perhaps despite Queen Marika's inability to help Malenia with her affliction, Miquella still loved his mother. Now beyond this point, we finally come to Elfile, Brace of the Haligtree. Here we find those most loyal to the twin prodigies, Cleanrot Knights, Haligtree soldiers, as well as the Children of Rot. But before we go further, we have to pass through the prayer room. And I asked the community once again on who this depiction might be. I got a lot of interesting answers, and thank you guys for that. But the answer that stuck most to me was that a lot of people pointed out that this might be Gowry. Not the Gowry that we know right now, who is in Caelid, but the Gowry that used to be. He called himself a great sage back in his time, and this could be a depiction of him as someone who understands the Scarlet Rot and the cycle of decay and rebirth. Are you guys seeing a pattern now? Again, something we'll come back to in the theory section. Now we also see images of this in Mog's Palace and other places like the Lake of Rot. But if you have a better answer than Gowry, please do let me know in the comments down below. Aside from the mages earlier, we finally see the humans who actually serve Miquella. And you'll notice that some of them have this shining aura within their chests. This aura is their faith to Lord Miquella, strong enough to burn them away as they blow themselves up as a way to light the path for the return of their lord. And I mentioned this previously in my Miquella video, but almost all the humans here are wearing helmets adorned with unalloyed gold, which increases their faith by 1, which could be the effect of the bewitching abilities of Miquella. You see a lot of these knights defending areas from outsiders. It makes you think, what exactly are they defending from? The rampage of the misbegotten outside? Or another possible interference from other demigods like Mohg? Or perhaps with the return of the slumbering Malenia, they tighten security even further. Now what's also weird is that these knights are defending the Haligtree, rather than looking for Miquella. It's as if they don't know that Miquella had been taken. And I think this is the case, as many of them are simply waiting and wishing for the return of their lord. I mean, even Sir Gideon, tarnished with approximate knowledge of everything, didn't know Miquella was taken. What more, lowly soldiers of the Haligtree. So they might be thinking that Miquella disappeared, but they're unaware that he was actually kidnapped. But that's just speculation. There are a bunch of stuff here that are just weird as well. At the ground floor of this area, there are multiple revenants, there are crystallians in the buildings, and it is here that we find Marika's sword seal. Now, revenants I don't really know much about, but they are associated with death and spirits. Killing one drops ghost gloveworts, which is used to strengthen spirits. Crystallians are creatures created from crystals who await the return of their lord so that more of them could be created. But crystallians are basically creatures that were carved out from crystals and given life. Beyond this area, we'll come to find the Children of Rot. Now, this is also an interesting area as this is already inside the Haligtree itself, and there's a hole that leads directly to the chamber which houses Miquella and Malenia. Was this hole created by Mohg? Was it always here? Or was it destroyed by something else? Or maybe it was even destroyed by the river of rock that's falling down. We also find these cocoon-like things which also envelop Miquella when we found him in Mogwyn's palace. What's inside of these? It's probably people, and these are probably for some sort of evolution or rebirth. What's also weird was how Miquella was stolen by Mohg. So easily, mind you, despite all the security around. It doesn't seem like he was wary of anyone going after him in the way Mohg did. But this of course was his biggest mistake, as it may have been his overconfidence that allowed Mohg to easily slip by. How? Well, Mohg was an omen, the type of people Miquella wished to save. I wouldn't be surprised if he was welcomed into the Haligtree in the first place. Not to mention, when we first ask about the unlocated demigods, Gideon Ofnir doesn't tell us much about Mohg. Just that the unlocated demigod was known as the Lord of Blood. Did he not know that it was Mohg? Or was Mohg just not that much of a factor that he didn't care? Something we're just not too sure about. Anyway, continuing down here, just before Miquella and Malenia's chamber, is a graveyard. Within, we see knights who still care for their loved ones and still watch over their graves. There are also knights that are grieving for probably recent losses, maybe from the Scarlet Rot or maybe from battles before. This is quite the odd place for a graveyard, no? This is right next to the chamber where Miquella placed himself, which if Miquella was your lord is kind of a weird place to be putting a graveyard. But again, we'll come back to that later. Now earlier we talked about the revenants and the ghost gloveworts that they were dropping, and now we find in this graveyard the third ghost glovewort bell-bearing, as well as a lot of gloveworts in this area. This could be something Miquella was trying to learn and experiment on. We also see down here a scarlet flower and a traveling maiden's clothes next to it. Now we don't know who this is. It could be one of Millicent's sisters, it could even be Malenia's first bloom like many are speculating, or maybe it was part of something more. So now let's talk about the crack theory that I have regarding what Miquella was trying to do with the Haligtree. From the Haligtree Surcoat, we know that Miquella was attempting to create a new Erdtree. So we have to look at what the Erdtree does in the lands between. Well, it does a lot of things, but I think the most prominent thing it does is it takes over the concept of death. Now, because the Rune of Death was removed from the Elden Ring, true death in the lands between is basically your soul returning to the Erdtree upon your death, and eventually being reborn by the grace of the Erdtree. However, there are many that are rejected by the Erdtree, such as those who live in death, the Albinorics, the Misbegotten, the Omens, and of course even the humans. These souls are left forever to wander the lands between in a sort of limbo. Many of them seek salvation, and Miquella sought to better the lives of everyone in the lands between. Now Miquella, despite his opposition to outer gods, still loves his family and doesn't really oppose the Golden Order. So he doesn't do something as crazy as, say, unbounding the Rune of Death. So what if he attempted to create the Haligtree as a new Erdtree that he could control? One that would allow him to take the souls of those rejected by the Erdtree and birth them anew. Sounds crazy, a little bit, but this cycle of rebirth is something that many have been trying to do, but not many have the power to do so. Take Renala for instance. Her amber egg, which was given by Radagon by the way, is able to provide a rebirth, but it always has a defect. And after the rebirth, the new life rarely lasts long. They have to be constantly rebirthed in order for them to maintain any semblance of life. The deathbed companions can somewhat achieve a proper rebirth, but it requires a whole lot of time and energy, and they're unable to provide for the many. So instead, they can only do so for nobles and exalted nobles. So my theory is that Miquella wanted to do something for the souls who were rejected by the Erdtree. So he studied life itself. Create a new Erdtree as the Haligtree in order to circumvent the unfair way the Erdtree rebirths souls. But what if he also wanted to take it one step further? Let's circle back to Castle Sol. Here Miquella had given a task for them to swallow the sun in order to provide rebirth to a soulless demigod. Now many believe that this spirit is talking about Godwyn, especially with the mention of Comrade and the Last Right Sword clearly talking about Miquella wanting Godwyn to die a true death. But I don't think that's the case. I think this spirit isn't talking about Godwyn, and quite frankly, I think he's just talking about the walking mausoleum right outside of Castle Sol. Walking mausoleums are said to hold the dead bodies of soulless demigods. I think this was one of Miquella's experiments on how to rebirth souls or place souls into new bodies. And if he could rebirth a demigod's soul, the normal souls would be far easier. We also find another walking mausoleum within the consecrated snowfields next to the apostate derelict, which houses the albinoric Philia, who is also meant to give life to new albinorics. Coincidence? Maybe. Going back to Last Rites, the reason why he also wants Godwyn to die a true death might be because he also wants to help Godwyn into a new rebirth. Now going back to the tree, throughout the Haligtree, we find creatures somewhat related to spirits, even if it's just a distant relation, as if he was scouring all the bits of information possible about spirits. He might have been studying revenants in order to learn about strengthening spirits through gloveworts. And like I said earlier, we even found some of these gloveworts in the graveyard. Could it be that he was trying to use this in order to strengthen the spirits of the deceased in order to prepare them for rebirth? He studied spirit snails in order to learn about spirit calling and summoning back spirits. He studied crystallians in order to gain knowledge about creating new life and possibly moving souls into the new life that he created. His study of the Scarlet Rot might also not just be to save his sister, but also in order to perfect his experiment. Remember, the Scarlet Rot embodies the cycle of decay and rebirth. And when we give the unalloyed gold needle to Gowry, what did he say about Miquella?
Now let me have a look. Well, this is a marvel indeed. The work of a true artisan, a meticulous, bold craftsman who grasps the essence of life.
A bold craftsman who grasps the essence of life. The scarlet flower we found in the graveyard could be part of that experiment too, learning the method of rebirth of the Scarlet Rot. It might even be Miquella's attempt of what Gowry was trying to do with Millicent, but Miquella succeeded earlier basically. So let's summarize. His creation of the needle not only allows no other gods to mess with his process, but also allowed him to see the true essence of life. His creation of the Haligtree was to allow rebirth of those rejected by the Erdtree. He might have been studying revenants, spirit snails, and crystallians in order to gain knowledge about strengthening spirits, calling spirits, and creating new life. His study of the scarlet rot could be a way to stop decay and allow rebirth. It appears that he was preparing to create his own world with his own laws. A world without influence of any outer god, and one where he would provide for all. Now, is his intention purely altruistic? Probably not, let's be honest. I mean, one of his powers is to bewitch people after all. That's already a big red flag. But we just don't know enough about Miquella to ascertain his true intentions. Malenia believed that Miquella was the most fearsome of all the Empyreans. For while the other demigods squabble for the power of the Elden Ring, Miquella was plotting not to take over the position of his mother, but to take over the greater will, the Erdtree, and all the outer gods. But that's pretty much it. This was a fun one to make. As I said, I do love Miquella as a demigod, but what do you guys think? Do you think there is some truth to my theory, or is it a little out there? What do you guys think Miquella was doing with the Haligtree? Let me know in the comments down below. And if you like this video, please do hit the like button. It really helps out. And if you're new to the channel, please don't forget to subscribe. Thanks very much for watching.